We all collectively spent too much time getting worked up about Chicago Bears storylines and narratives that weren't that big of a deal or never even ended up happening.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. On the show today, I want to go back through the most overblown of the offseason narratives and storylines. Now that we're kind of through the thick of the offseason, training camp right around the corner, we can take a stock at what we spent too much time getting worked up about or thinking about and working through, and things that weren't that big of a deal or just never really came to fruition, whether it's potential trades or free agent signings, other drama around the team. I want to go through some of the spots that I think we spent so much effort and energy, whether it's in social media debates or even sometimes on this podcast, talking about that just didn't end up really coming to fruition in any real way. I think the thing that has lingered the longest throughout the offseason, that was really here, kind of lingered through the end of last season and maybe still hasn't gone away despite nothing happening for 6 months on this front, is the running back position. We have, between the lead up to free agency, then free agency itself, then the lead up to the draft itself, post-draft free agents, trade targets, all throughout the offseason, Chicago Bears fans have spent a lot of time looking at DeAndre Swift replacements. I think it started when Ben Johnson was hired. It's okay, he traded DeAndre Swift away from the Detroit Lions. Is he going to come here and trade DeAndre Swift away from the Chicago Bears? Because I think we were already ready to trade away DeAndre Swift after a really disappointing first season. And you add in the coach who had previously traded him away before, and it was all right, great. Time to move on from that free agent miss, as we'll categorize it at the time, and get a new running back in there. But then that never happened. There really weren't any sort of concrete DeAndre Swift trade rumors either. It's something the fan base speculated about loosely, but we never had any reporting of him being on the trade block, of the Bears exploring trades, of the Bears offering trades. It has been pretty consistent from start to finish that DeAndre Swift is here and was going to be here and was always going to be here. And it ended up being a pretty darn overblown narrative that he wouldn't make it through with the team this offseason. But okay, even if they weren't going to trade away DeAndre Swift, they were still going to go and get an upgrade, right? Whether it was going into free agency with players like, Javonte Williams from the Denver Broncos, or even Najee Harris from the Steelers, I think was a name that was floated out there. I don't think there was as much smoke for running backs right at the beginning of free agency, because I think we were all a little bit more focused on, of course, the offensive line and the defensive line and some of the big targets the Bears may have been going after in those positions. So running back was a little bit more of a secondary conversation around the beginning of free agency. But you come back later after the draft in free agency, and we get into the Nick Chubb and J.K. Dobbins free agent, quote-unquote, running back targets. And then we got some very unsubstantiated, I don't even want to say reports. It was a radio host in Ohio claimed that the Bears were going to work out Nick Chubb or whatever, and that never actually happened. And Nick Chubb ends up going to Houston or somewhere else. I don't remember where he signed, but obviously not a Chicago Bear. And then J.K. Dobbins leaves the Chargers. He signs elsewhere. Not a Chicago Bear. They didn't sign a big free agent running back the way that we had wondered if they would. But all throughout the draft, that was the big Chicago Bears narrative. Is Ashton Jeanty going to make it to the 10th overall pick? Should the Bears trade up from 10 to draft Ashton Genty? How far should they go? If they can't get Genty, should they stay at 10 and take Omarion Hampton from North Carolina? Should they trade down from 10 and then still land Omarion Hampton? And even after the first round, when they take Colston Loveland, it's still like, well, in the second round, maybe they can still get Quinshon Judkins or Travion Henderson from Ohio State. And certainly there was a ton of pre-draft smoke. I don't even know if it was smoke or just speculation, but pre-draft talk about running back Caleb Johnson from Iowa potentially being a really strong fit with Ben Johnson. I don't know if there was ever like anything that directly connected them publicly, but still that was thought to be a running back who could be a selection for this team. And they go through all 3 second-round picks and don't draft running back until they get to the 7th round. And so that's what leads to the Nick Chubb and J.K. Dobbins conversation picking up after the draft, because they didn't address it in free agency before the draft and waited till the 7th round to address it during the draft. So surely, if this ongoing offseason narrative of not wanting Swift or wanting to replace or upgrade Swift is true, then they must sign one of these running backs. But they don't. And Ryan Poles repeatedly tells us, like, no, we're confident with the room that we have, and we're always looking to upgrade the roster, but for now we're going to stick with the guys that we have. And yet, for some reason, that wasn't enough to really squash this, because then, Breece Hall trade rumors start picking up, and it's not even rumors, it's speculation. I shouldn't even use the word rumors, because there was never any kind of reporting that the Bears were making calls or anything. But Breece Hall from the Jets, then James Cook from the Bills is a name that's thrown out there, Kenneth Walker from the Seahawks. Notably, none of those 3 players have even been traded to other teams, so it's not like there were trade talks for the Bears to have been involved in that ended up, they ended up getting outbid or something by some other team. Like, there hasn't been a running back trade this offseason, as far as I can tell. I went back and looked at the trade transaction wire, and I didn't notice any upon a quick cursory glance through the trade market. So there just hasn't been that, like, player that, the Bears are going to go and acquire via trade. And all along through the process, they have shown you, and even told you, but definitely more shown you through their actions, that they are comfortable enough with DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson, and add Kyle Mullenguy, and maybe they still want to add some depth. A free agent like Jamal Williams is a name we've talked about before on this podcast. That might make sense. A veteran minimum guy to be a backup to compete with Johnson and Mullenguy and Travis Homer, like that could still be on the table, but none of that is the offseason narrative of, they got to get rid of DeAndre Swift. They want to get rid of DeAndre Swift. I mean, I think Bears fans wanted to see DeAndre Swift go, and this felt like something that was sort of like trying to will it into existence. And Chicago decided, hey, listen, we got bigger fish to fry here. Like, running back isn't ideal, but it was never the biggest need on this Bears roster this offseason, and it's currently not the Bears' biggest need. We did a podcast, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, comparing the Bears running back room to other running back rooms around the NFL, and why this is not the worst running back field in the NFL right now. Sure, they're in the lower half, for sure. It's not a top running back room, but like, this group can be fine. That's part of why you hired Ben Johnson, is to scheme up a running game. And part of why you upgraded the offensive line is to help improve the running game, so that these maybe lesser running backs that you have can be, at a minimum, good enough with everything else you have to help support them, and Caleb Williams, and then the defense and everything that sort of ripples out from there. So all this running back stuff has felt very tiresome over the course of the offseason, because it's really been kind of the longest running thing that's been lingering, and maybe still hasn't quite fully gone away, because you still see Bears fans making up trades to get a running back from some other team, especially even after the Dolphins-Steelers trades. They were trying to trade for, I think it was Achane from the Dolphins, and trying to look at different options. Like, it's not, if it hasn't happened yet, it's not going to happen now. They're rolling with Swift and Roschon as the number 1, number 2 back here in Chicago. But that's not the only offseason storyline and narrative that got a little bit overblown, but I think that's the longest running one. But one that was a bit more acute and came on really strong, and I think has died down a little better than I hoped it would, is the Caleb Williams, or a little better than I thought it would, I guess, is the Caleb Williams ESPN Seth Wickersham book story about not wanting to be in Chicago. And I want to take stock of, like, has that gone away already? It feels quicker than I would have expected, and we'll see how that might still linger or not linger next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. Because you're already following the action, so why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. Whether it's those sports or you can even bet ahead on the upcoming football season. There's odds for Bears-Vikings in Week 1, Ben Johnson's Coach of the Year odds, Caleb Williams' passing yards, prop bets, NFC North and playoff odds for the Bears, and so much more, all in the FanDuel app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And if you're new to FanDuel, now's a great time to get started because new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. So I think the running back narrative has been kind of the longest running, but it hasn't had these like big crescendos. It's kind of just been little peaks around the draft and around Nick Chubb and then around some of these trade targets. But I think that the narrative offseason storyline that kind of rose above the rest in terms of like the most intense at its peak was the Caleb Williams, Seth Wickersham, ESPN story. This felt fairly bombshell when it came out, as far as like we hadn't seen a quarterback story like this kind of since Eli Manning. I realize that this story comes out a year later after it actually had happened, so it wasn't as though there was much immediate drama, but it's still the kind of national story that's not just a local regional story, right? The Caleb Williams story from this ESPN thing with Seth Wickersham is something that, San Francisco 49ers fans and Miami Dolphins fans heard about, right? Like those fan bases, maybe they didn't hear about the Nick Chubb stuff or a lot of the Caleb Johnson stuff, right? Those sort of smaller, longer narratives are more kind of localized. But this Caleb Williams story was a big national controversy. And as because of its size and scope, it felt to me like something that was going to linger for a while. And I think the Bears' response and approach has helped minimize a lot of that, but I also don't think it's gone away completely. So just to sort of recap the details here to make sure we're not missing anything. You may recall in the story that entering the draft last year, Caleb Williams did not want the Chicago Bears to draft him. He was concerned about offensive coordinator Shane Waldron and just the history of failure to develop quarterbacks in Chicago. And so he and his dad were trying to find a way to get around the NFL draft process. Could they go to the XFL or whatever? Or could they sit out? Or, could they find some way to not be drafted by the Chicago Bears with the first overall pick? And, he had met with the Minnesota Vikings at the Combine, and so he really wanted to be a Viking. And so, like, all of that built up this drama of, like, not only does Caleb not want to be here, but also he was right about the offensive coordinator. His dad is now some shadow figure in the background that's pitting him against the Bears. And, of course, of all the teams he wants to play for, it's the division rival. Like, it was the perfect sandwich or cocktail of seeming disaster for the Chicago Bears. But I think the fact that it is basically a year old when it came out really helped soften a lot of the impact. Like there was a solid, was it a week where it was like we hadn't heard from Caleb Williams and we hadn't even heard from Ben Johnson for the first handful of days. And it was like, this is bubbling and stirring and everyone's wondering, is Caleb Williams going to want out now? Is he going to want to be traded or whatever? There was a lot of unaddressed and unspoken aspects of it that like, when there's a void of information there, then misinformation creeps in, or where communication lacks, negativity fills, and that's kind of what happened there when we were still waiting to hear from the Bears and Caleb Williams. All the stuff started building up, and it's like, oh man, it really felt like at the time, this is going to be one of those off-season stories that doesn't go away, because anytime there's anything that goes wrong, everyone's immediately going to jump to, oh, Caleb Williams doesn't want to be there. I do give him especially, but Ben Johnson as well, a lot of credit for addressing it properly and head on. I think Caleb maybe took a little longer than you would have liked, but I don't think it was necessarily intentional. I think it was just kind of a scheduling thing. I think they would have been smarter to address it a little bit quicker, but nonetheless, they did a good job of not hiding from it, not brushing it off or downplaying it, but instead like acknowledging it and being fairly transparent. I wouldn't say completely transparent, but like being open about it and kind of, like I said, acknowledging it and just kind of like correcting it in the sense of saying like, hey, that was then, things have changed, this is now, right? And if they had sort of downplayed it, maybe you wouldn't believe them, but I think their ability to kind of like accept it and say things have changed and that was the past was the most effective strategy for not letting it continue to get bigger and bigger and be this storyline that lingered. Like it really, by the time we got to mandatory minicamp and then voluntary OTAs, it wasn't really a story anymore, at least around those times. I mean, Caleb Williams shows up for more voluntary OTAs even after like veterans didn't have to be there, and he still chooses to show up. Like he's continued the same pattern of behavior before the story went out of pure dedication to the Chicago Bears. Like he's done everything you would want him to do to keep this storyline from being that big of a deal. Now that being said, it just because it has died down almost completely now, I just wonder, I have a feeling that we won't really hear much about it through training camp, preseason, and all that stuff, but regular season, it feels like it's going to be a TV broadcast kind of conversation where it comes up, whether it's a pregame show or a halftime show or just, one of the storylines that the color commentator are talking about lead up, like Monday Night Football against the Minnesota Vikings. They're going to talk about how Caleb Williams wanted to play for the Minnesota Vikings, even though it is practically like irrelevant to the game. Like functionally, it has no relevance. I mean, other than Caleb Williams' relationship with Kevin O'Connell, like, does that mean anything? It doesn't mean anything for the game being played in week one. The fact that Caleb wanted to play for the Vikings has zero impact on anything that happens in that game. But it's too juicy and dramatic and entertaining of a storyline not to at least bring up for that Bears-Vikings game. And probably the second Bears-Vikings game it'll come up again, especially though the first one, primetime Monday Night Football, like, of course, they're going to talk about it. Will it come up any more in the season? I mean, the second Vikings game, and you wonder, like, the other main thing I wonder is, like, if the Bears, after the first Bears loss, or the first, or if there's any kind of body language from Caleb Williams at all, are people going to keep coming back to that? Or maybe it takes a losing streak, right? If they lose 2 or 3 games in a row, are people going to, maybe even just as much as just trolling Bears fans about it, but that's the part to me that doesn't feel like it's going to completely go away, at least not this season. But if the Bears overall have a successful season and, they finish above 500 and make a playoff push, I think then, after a fully successful season in Chicago, then it will be gone because, when you can associate Caleb Williams with having success with the Bears, then there's not going to really be any question that he still wants to be there if the team is having success. And if the team doesn't have success, then it's only going to pick up and grow even stronger. And that's kind of the double-edged sword that you're teetering on with this narrative that I think was overblown at the time, but could linger a bit longer and be a bit of trouble. So that to me is the really big one. I think maybe the second biggest one though, like the next biggest peak, the highest of the high that didn't last a long time, but it was a big offseason storyline. And then in an instant, it was gone, was in the lead up to free agency. And there was one player in particular that Chicago Bears fans were obsessed with this team acquiring this offseason. And lo and behold, they didn't. But they got someone, dare I say, better in response that really made the whole narrative disappear really quickly. So we'll take a look at one of the other big storyline off seasons as it revolved around the lead up to free agency next on Locked On Bears. Before we got to the Caleb Williams story, before we got to the NFL draft and running backs and mock draft picks, in the real, even before we got to the start of free agency, maybe even before they hired Ben Johnson, because I think it was even during the last regular season, Chicago Bears fans had a free agent target that they wanted above anyone else. And it felt like it was the only player off the team, like a player on another team, that Bears fans were talking about throughout January and February and maybe in the beginning of March, but the exact timeline's a little bit fuzzy for me. But do you remember how much time everyone spent talking about Trey Smith, the Kansas City Chiefs guard, and how now in hindsight, maybe overdid it a little bit, that, he was never actually available for the Chicago Bears, that he never hit the free agent market, and perhaps there was some discussion of a franchise tag and trade situation. I mean, that we don't know, but I guess that was kind of in reality, that was the only possibility the Bears ever had of acquiring Trey Smith. But he was everybody's free agent target number one. I mean, I guess I don't want to say everybody, but, because personally I wasn't that big of a Trey Smith fan, but like it was all you would see everywhere. Any kind of free agent target list, mock off-season free agent projections, it was Bears and Trey Smith. Ryan Poles obviously had the connection to him with the Kansas City Chiefs. Offensive line was this huge, massive need for the Chicago Bears, and the Bears had a ton of salary cap space, so it makes sense that they could afford to go out and pay the potential top free agent guard if he hits free agency. And the other side of it was that the Chiefs had a lot of moves to try and make, and it wasn't clear whether they would be able to retain Trey Smith, if they could, find a way to get everybody under the salary cap and make contracts work. And maybe it was going to require Travis Kelce to retire, but then Kelce didn't retire, so then do they not have the money? And lo and behold, they kept Trey Smith. And I think there was this big, temporary but immediate disappointment from Chicago Bears fans of, couldn't get the big name top guard on the free agent market. Oh no. But then Ryan Poles, of course, had another trick up his sleeve, pulled an ace out with Joe Thuney, the other Kansas City Chiefs guard. I was a really brilliant magic trick, right? Everyone's looking at the Trey Smith over here, and then what does he pull out from behind here? Joe Thuney, a better player, just an older player, but better right now, at least for this year. I'd take Joe Thuney over Trey Smith. If all else is created equal, then you add in how much cheaper Joe Thuney is, and it's a no-brainer type of situation for the Bears there in the short term, for sure. And then the Trey Smith thing is all but forgotten, right? Like you get, in very quick succession, you go Joe Thuney, I don't even remember the order. Was it Jackson first and then Joe Thuney? I don't remember, but it was Jackson and Thuney in trades, and then free agency started, and Drew Dahlman, and boom, you just, in a whirlwind, just rebuilt the entire interior offensive line. And whoever cares about that Trey Smith guy, we didn't need him anyway. What a bum. Like that, it was that quickly. That's what I mean by like overblown offseason narrative of like Trey Smith or bust. Not that big of a deal. But he wasn't the only free agent target and big name that we probably spent too much time, fantasizing about and dreaming about the Bears building the roster with all these great offseason additions. I mean, to his credit, Ryan Poles did spend a decent amount of money in free agency. It just wasn't on, outside of Drew Dahlman, it wasn't on the players that we maybe expected he would. I mean, Dahlman was like the one guy that Bears fans nailed from the get-go. Highest paid center, let's go get him. And Ryan Poles said, let's go get him. Like that one is not overblown. That one was a worthwhile consternation and projection. Like, cool. I'm glad we got that one right. But there was so much talk about, Eagles defensive tackle Milton Williams to be the big splash defensive line signing for the Bears, and that didn't ultimately end up coming through. Or Eagles edge rusher Josh Sweat could have been the big Bears free agent signing. It seemed like all the big free agent Eagles, Mekhi Becton on the offensive line too. It's like that's who everyone was looking for, because of course they just won the Super Bowl, and so you look at that talent and you think, wow, I would love to have some of that Super Bowl talent on my team. And of course, the Bears didn't sign any of those Eagles free agents. There was a while where Bears fans were talking about Khalil Mack returning to Chicago, the return of the Mack, and him being the edge rusher to pair with Montez Sweat. And can you imagine Khalil Mack and Montez Sweat in Chicago? Oh my gosh, because we weren't sure exactly what the Chargers were going to do with Khalil Mack and then Joey Bosa. Of course, they end up moving on from Bosa and keeping Khalil Mack around, and so Mack doesn't really become a realistic option for the Chicago Bears throughout that process, but we sure talked about it a lot. And even some other big name offensive linemen, before they traded for Jackson and Tooney and signed Drew Dahlman, but Will Freeze from the Indianapolis Colts, Ryan Kelly from the Colts, Mekhi Becton from the Eagles is a name we already talked about, Aaron Banks for the 49ers who goes to Green Bay. Like we spent a lot of time going through all the different offensive line and defensive linemen that the Bears could go out and sign big money. And then I didn't hear many people talking about Dayo Odeyingbo from the Indianapolis Colts. That wasn't a name that was on a ton of radars as far as the big splash edge rusher signing. And of course, no one was talking about Grady Jarrett from the Falcons because he was a salary cap casualty. So we didn't think or know that Grady Jarrett would be available. So that's kind of one of the lessons here is not only is everything unpredictable and we end up wasting a lot of time talking about players and transactions that are never going to happen, but then you don't even know the ones that could happen because we didn't know Joe Tooney would be available. We didn't know Grady Jarrett would be available. And those were two of the biggest moves the Bears made all offseason. And we never would have even had a chance to speculate about that. One of the things I will say that I'll admit to pushing for and probably getting more wrong than a lot of other people is I really expected the Bears to get more players with ties to Ben Johnson and Dennis Allen. Of course, they got Jonah Jackson, who had played for Ben Johnson before, but a lot of the other players they brought in weren't players who directly had played for at least the leaders of this coaching staff before. I think Olamide Zaccheaus might have crossed over in Washington. No, I don't think he did cross over in Washington with Eric Bieniemy, but certainly on defense, Dayo Odeyingbo was in Indianapolis with the Bears linebackers coach, so you kind of had a loose connection there, but none of the coaches had worked with Tooney. I know, I guess Eric Bieniemy had worked with Tooney a long time ago in Kansas City, but that was a Ryan Poles connection. None of the coaches had worked with Drew Dahlman. None of the coaches had worked with Grady Jarrett. This wasn't some big reunion tour. We spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about Lions guard Kevin Zeitler as the obvious guard for the Bears to sign in free agency. He should be affordable. Ben Johnson knows him. He's a good player. It just seemed made a lot of sense to go out and sign Kevin Zeitler. But then, of course, you trade for Jackson and Tooney ahead of free agency, so then you don't really have room for Zeitler, so the Bears don't sign him. And we talked about wide receiver Tim Patrick as a potential fit to pair with Rome Odunze and DJ Moore as the number 3 wide receiver in Chicago. Knows the offense, experienced receiver, shouldn't be super expensive, but is not just some bum, can be productive for you. There was a lot of different players. And even on defense, Chase Young from the New Orleans Saints was a guy we talked about as pass rusher, teammates with Montez Sweat, played for Dennis Allen. He's a Dennis Allen guy. There's all these players we could point to say, this coaching staff already knows them. Go out and get them and make them that familiar signing. And that wasn't nearly as big of a priority for the Chicago Bears as we might have thought it would have been. For this coaching staff, they didn't have to get their guys. They just wanted to get guys they thought were good. And I think there's a value to that. And there's humility, is that quite the right sentiment here? But right, it's not it's taking some of the nepotism out of it, right? It feels more merit-based. Just say, go get the best guys, whether I've worked with them or not. But I also think there's more risk in signing players that you think might be better, but you haven't worked with them before, so you aren't as sure how good they are, right? Sort of a devil you know versus a devil you don't. They went with the one they don't, which could mean they got better players, or it could mean they got worse players because they just have less information about how good those players will be for them. But we'll certainly keep tabs on how good all of the Bears offseason additions are right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We're not quite a full 5 days a week right now, but we're sticking with a Monday, Tuesday, Thursday podcast schedule until training camp comes back around, and then we'll ramp back up to a full 5 days a week all throughout the rest of the year. So that's why you got to hit the subscribe button, stay subscribed, so you're not missing out on any of our podcasts. Keep making us your first listen each and every day, at least each and every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And on those other days, be sure to check out another Locked On podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We've got MLB, NBA, and NHL teams covered across all the 4 major sports, every team, plus a bunch of college sports across the country with Locked On podcasts. So go check out another Locked On Podcast Network podcast for your second listen today. Then come on back on Monday, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.